live in a world where we deeply know we're fragile. This is the way that we're different than like my dog or whatever. I think that we experience that fragility. We know we're going to die, and that the people that we love are going to die. And so there's real grief around just being a vulnerable human being that we that's like honest. It's like honest about our state of who we are.
Tish, welcome to the happy hour.
Thank you for having me. It's fun to be actually with you.
Well, it is so fun to have you here on the happy hour. And I need to say this for the listeners and for you too. Whenever I have people on the show that I have fallen in love with their work, and then they sit in front of me or I sit across the screen from them, I feel giddy and honored. And so I feel that way about you being here.
Thank you.
So I need to say that I read your book, Prayer in the Night. It came out in 2021. Okay. I read it in 2021. At the end of the year, I declared it the best book I read all year.
Wow.
And then it wasn't too long that I think Christianity Today declared it the best book of the year.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Well, it got book of the year. I don't think they
threw
use
in the best.
best.
I threw in the best. But literally, when I saw that, I was like, I want everyone to. I found the best book of the year, you guys. And so I read your book in 2021 along with some friends, and it just hit me in really, really great needed spaces. And so then my friend Lindsay, who works here, had already told me about it, and so then I went back and I read Liturgy of the Ordinary, and so I am now trying to go through everything that you read, everything that you've written.
Thanks.
And so I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here.
So glad. Okay, so we were talking before. Well, first of all, introduce yourself, because I want everyone to know from your mouth who you are and what you do.
My name is Tish Harrison Warren, and I do all kinds of things. I'm an Anglican priest.
You do a lot of things, I've learned.
Yeah. I'm an Anglican priest. I am a writer. That's my primary gig right now. I write a weekly newsletter for the New York Times on faith in public discourse and private life. Okay. And I am an author of a couple of books, and write occasionally here and there for other things as well. And I have 3 kids, a 12-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 3-year-old.
Busy stuff.
Yeah, so I'm tired.
Because you have a lot going on.
And I'm so glad to be here. I might just stay after the podcast to sit in a quiet room.
We're going to go home. There's a couch here. I got a blanket for you.
Yes.
Take a nap.
That's actually why I came.
Good. I want to just back up for a second and talk about something that we were talking about right before we started recording. And I said, wait.
Yes.
Tell me when we're recording. So you asked me, which of those 2 books did I like the best? Prayer in the Night or Liturgy of the Ordinary? And I told you Prayer in the Night. And then you proceeded to tell me what?
Well, I asked you what your Enneagram number was.
Yes, and I'm an Enneagram 6. Everyone that listens knows.
So people should know, listeners should know, I'm not, there's some folks that are like super into the Enneagram, and I'm not. Like, I don't even know my number.
I'll tell you by the end what your number is.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
just kidding. That's
it's
totally not allowed.
It's between 2 things, and I just think I'm both. And I know you're not. That's not how it works, but I think I just am. But anyway, so but my kind of operations manager assistant, who's wonderful, and has sort of developed this like completely untested, unproven theory that different Enneagram numbers prefer different books of mine. So,
and do a lot of 6s fall under Prayer in the Night?
So Prayer in the Night is beloved of, so I need to say this. IVP marketing would be sad, but all Enneagram numbers should buy both books.
Yes.
And all people across the Enneagram spectrum have enjoyed both books.
Yes.
So it's not like you hate one.
Totally.
I mean,
yes.
Yeah. It's not like, whatever, 2s hate Prayer in the Night or something. But typically 4s and 6s, sometimes 8s, love prayer in the night.
That's so interesting.
And 1s and 2s really love Liturgy of the Ordinary.
That's
and then the others, like 3, 5, 9, 7, I actually don't have data on. So,
I love your, it's just
so
like
I
a little
don't
4th
know.
grade science experiment.
Yes. I have no idea. This is an unscientific study. So, I mean, I love both books. You can, if you've written books, you love them both all. It's like children. So I can't pick a favorite one in that sense. But Liturgy of the Ordinary was my first book, and it was so it was just so exciting to get to write a book. And so there's like a first love, kind of first crush element to that and it really launched my career. I mean, it did much better than we were expecting, because I was essentially unknown. And so I'm always very grateful for that book. And I mean, I think Prayer in the Night is a better book. Or it's different in the sense that if Liturgy of the Ordinary is kind of first love, Prayer in the Night is like when it's gotten really hard, when love has gotten really hard, and figuring out how do you kind of keep going.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it's an older book, or it's a book that feels, they both feel really authentic in the sense that I was trying to really come out of where I was, and they both deal a lot with my own struggles. I don't know how you would write without writing about your struggles.
Yourself, right?
But there's something that's more kind of hard won, I think, in some ways. I mean, that book, Prayer in the Night, about killed me to write, and it was a hard book to write, and it was pretty painful to write in moments. And so not that Liturgy of the Ordinary was a walk in the park, because it was a new project. But it feels like
Prayer in the Night was like, you had to go deep into some deep soul places and grief, and going back and visiting grief, I think, is like so exhausting.
Right.
And so you're pouring yourself out.
So I've said this, I think, elsewhere, but you know, when I got the idea for Prayer in the Night, I was actually on a writing a writing retreat is too fancy. Like when I had very small kids, and when you're a writer with small kids, it is not uncommon, if you have very kind friends, that some friends of mine were going out of town. So they were like, do you want to come like sleep at our house overnight and work?
Yeah.
And so I went to write a different book that was much more sort of like doctrinal and, you know, because I don't know, it's more, I don't want to say it was more theological, but it was more sort of straightforwardly theological. And this book, the idea of Prayer for the Night came and like just wouldn't leave me alone. It was like this cat that followed me home and like would not, like once it was there, it was like, this book has to be written.
Yeah.
But I did not want to write it. And I told God, I had 3 reasons that I did not want to write it. Oh, do you want me to say all 3? This could be a long answer.
Well, I'm just trying to know what it was that you were not willing to write.
One of them, I'm happy to tell you all 3. Depends on how long of an answer you want. But the one that I was bringing up, because it kind of relates to what you were saying, is that, you know, this was 2018, sort of. I can't remember when. It was like middle to end. I remember the weather was really nice. So it was like spring or summer 2018. So it was about a year after these events, the events that kind of the book starts with. And I was just beginning to kind of heal.
Yep.
And it felt like I was just beginning to like breathe again or be able to like, I don't even know if I was at a place of like joy and belief again, but it was a place where I could like maybe think that could come again, you know? And I I don't get into this deeply in the book, not because I was avoiding it, just because it was too much. But our like all of the events that I kind of talk about in the book were like really hard on our marriage.
Yeah.
And we were just there was a lot of healing happening, or we were in counseling and there was healing. So it was like things were just starting to kind of heal a little bit. And it felt like, oh Lord, I do not want to go back and have to look at all this. Like, I don't want to have to go back and feel all this again. Yep. Like, I felt it. I'm ready to, like, can I just write a book about, I don't know,
something
10 steps to a joyful life?
Yes. Yes.
Something.
Yeah.
Or something, you know, it just felt like, oh man, that's a dark place to have to walk back into.
Yeah.
That
doesn't surprise me, because I think anytime you've been through something, unless you're writing in the middle of it, which I would say majority of people are not. I mean, there might be journaling or whatever, but like no one's trying to like write a book in the middle of their grief normally. You know, they're just like trying to get through the day. And then to have to go back and enter into spaces that you already left, it's super, super. Not only is it difficult, to me, it's plain exhausting. Totally. And you're literally just like, because you feel all the feelings over again, and the feelings that you already dealt with and that you already went through.
Yeah. But what I found in the process of writing the book is that I actually hadn't really dealt with that. There were certainly things I had, and like I said, I was in counseling, but the central sort of struggle that I bring to the book, I had not really faced. And that is it's in the second chapter. So this struggle is the silver thread in some ways through the book, but particularly in the second chapter, there's this part where I say, I tell this story about my pastor Hunter, who says we cannot trust God to keep bad things from happening to us, which I heard in a sermon in college. And I knew that, but there was some sense of like, are we allowed to say that out loud? And so I write in the book, so if we can't trust God to keep bad things from happening to us, how do we trust God at all? And when I write pretty much every day, and I had nothing else to say. I wrote that sentence, and it was like the sentence of my soul at the moment.
There it was.
It was like the question, and I had no answer. So I sat there for another maybe 10 minutes, and I was like, I don't have the next sentence. And so I closed the computer, and I didn't come back to the computer for like over a week. 'Cause I just was like,
what do I do?
I don't know the answer. Yeah. I have a book contract signed.
But I don't have the answer.
And so it really took me I wrote about 80,000 words, and then, which is a crazy long book. And then I whittled it down to about 40,000, which is a normal size book. And wrestled with that over a period of about a year and a half. And that's what it took for me to actually be able to reckon with how does one trust God. Yeah. So it's funny because the other book I was going to write that I was drawn to is a fine book to write, and maybe I'll write it again someday.
One day.
But it was much more sort of, like I said, doctrinal. And I honestly think I was using theology to avoid the central question of my life, which was, how do you trust God? And that was all wrapped in loads of grief, loads of distrust, loads of doubt and unbelief. And I was sort of like avoiding the question, maybe even avoiding the question with a book on theology, right? And so that dare to kind of like, this is the book, I think it was because, the Lord was sort of after me actually facing the question I didn't want to face.
I wonder, you said you were avoiding that question like with theology. And that sentence got me thinking, like, we all do this. It may not be theology.
Right.
It could be something else. And sometimes I think there are moments when I can have a good theology of something, but push comes to shove when I haven't walked through that, it gets a lot harder. Like, like I'm trying to say, like, if I were to lose a spouse to death, like my grief would have to come into play, and the theology, although it would be there, it couldn't take over for my grief. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, I'm super for theology. I'm super for wrestling with doctrine. And in some ways, we can't quite process anything or any emotion without it. Yeah. Because any emotion, we bring questions to, like, I mean, even ought we listen to our emotions? That is a deeply, like, theological, philosophical question. Like, if you lose a spouse, like, is there hope in the midst of that?
Yeah.
So there is some sense where, I just think, liturgy, the ordinary, like, pouring a cup of coffee is theological. So you can't get away from that.
Right.
At the same time, I think there's something in what you're saying that we can think of theology primarily as this cognitive exercise. And so I do see this, even as a pastor, I see this where people in grief can sometimes go to, like, the answer or want, the sort of, I don't know, the kind of, like, pat or acceptable kind of Christian response. And it's a way, actually a reviewer of my book said this. They said, it's made me realize that I use theology to cork my sense of grief.
Wow.
To quiet my sense of my emotions of
anger.
Almost,
we feel like if we show those emotions, then we maybe don't trust God, or maybe God isn't good.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe God will leave us in the midst of it.
Yeah.
I think some of those emotions for me were coming because I didn't trust God. But the response to God is not surprised by that. It is hard to be a human being and to live your life trusting God.
Yep.
And so I think the response to that isn't to sort of, like, pretend we have the right answer or pretend that we're in a different spot. But look at the psalmist all the time. He's like, where are you?
Right.
Why
have you forsaken me?
Yes. Why have you forsaken me? How long, O Lord? How long? I was just reading this morning of, the psalmist is reciting, like, you have done this in the past. You delivered these people and you have forgotten us. Like, what? Can you?
Those are real emotions.
Those are real emotions. And I think a lot of, if you brought that to, many pastors, they would say, oh, don't, the response of, like, God hasn't forgotten you, which of course God hasn't forgotten the psalmist, but there was something faithful in even expressing that, because remember, he's, like, expressing that God has forgotten him in a promise to God. Right. So he's practicing lament.
That's what I was going to say, and I think that's something that we struggle with.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely in this world. Yeah. You said this in your book. You said, but unless we make space for grief, so you're writing, probably learning this yourself. You said, but unless we make space for grief, we cannot know the depths of the love of God, the healing God wrings from pain, the way grieving yields wisdom, comfort, even joy. If we do not make time for grief, it will not simply disappear. Grief is stubborn. It will make itself heard, or we will die trying to silence it. Yeah. If we don't face it directly, it comes out sideways in ways that aren't always recognizable as grief. Explosive anger, uncontrollable anxiety, compulsive shallowness, brooding, bitterness, unchecked addiction. Grief is a ghost that can't be put to rest until its purpose has been fulfilled.
Yep.
Everyone takes a deep breath on that one. It's going to come out.
Yeah.
And did you find that, because you just said, as you were journeying through writing this book, you had to even go back and acknowledge some things that you hadn't dealt with. Did you find having to go through this as you were writing, this grief coming out, or were you just aware of how it had?
Oh, no. And still, I still.
This is let's not act like we're both
all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's all kinds of times now where I'm just like snapping at my husband or really, really anxious. And I have to sort of be like, what is underneath this?
Yeah.
I had a counselor who said, underneath anger is typically sorrow or fear. And so, but those both sorrow and fear are kind of vulnerable to feel and admit. And so anger can be a real, a way to, it feels less vulnerable. And there's certainly not anything wrong with anger, but when I just feel like this kind of irrational when I'm like, this is,
where did this come from? What is this?
Yeah. Or that it's just, by coming out sideways, I just mean that it's like, I'm reacting really unkindly or really impatiently, or that I still have to stop and be like, what is underneath this? What's the fear underneath this? What's the grief underneath this? And I think I didn't grow up in a home that like was, we didn't talk about grief. That wasn't, and so I think, I certainly saw it was learning through the writing of this book, but also I just see it everywhere. I mean, I think, I say this in the book, but my husband, anger has always been something that he's sort of struggled with. He was very into, but like in college and kind of before and after his like conversion to Christianity, he was super into punk rock. And there's something really, really beautiful and good about that. But he would say like some of it was just he just had a lot of aggression, and the mosh pit. I mean, people would just like wail on each other, just beat each other up at shows, and he just thought that was the best. Like it was just so. It was interesting. I mean, of course, that affected our marriage in all kinds of like not great ways. And we both have some of that. It's not just him. I mean, we brought all kinds of baggage into our relationship. But as we've both kind of had to face that, what came out, and again, I said this in the book, but like, he just like when he started dealing with that, he just cried
because there was so much sorrow
the time.
In there.
Yeah, I mean, just sometimes he would not even know. I mean, I think it was just his father passed away when he was 11, and he just had some stuff that he had never really grieved, and he cried enough where this sweet woman in our church like brought him a gift wrapped, and it was handkerchiefs.
Oh, because she'd seen him crying so much.
Well, because he also is a priest, so he would cry when he just started where like all his sermons he started crying. He was just crying all the time, in his sermons, in his teaching, in his worship, and it just was such a sign. It was so sweet, and it was such a sign of healing. It felt like it was like something in him was tapping into something really that had been waiting to be heard for a long time. And I just think that's true. I think Martha Nussbaum she's a philosopher that talks about emotions as, she calls them hot cognitions, meaning they communicate. Some cognitions are thoughts, but that she talks about how we can sort of think about rationality as the thing that speaks truth, and emotions as sort of just feelings, or something less than, but that she would really say emotions are communicating something really true. And so, I think David Foster Wallace says, this is one of my favorite quotes. He says, "The truth will set you free, but not until it's finished with you." And I think that's what I'm getting at with the grief thing, is like the grief in our life is saying something actually true. And you can't, the only way to kind of get on the other side of it is to go through it.
Yeah.
Like you can't
listen to it
go
and deal
around
with it. Yeah.
And because it's a tutor, it's you're needing to really learn what it has to say.
Yeah.
So
I think that is why, Enneagram aside, I resonated with the book Prayer in the Night so much, is because I look back, and 2021 was a hard year for me emotionally, finding out some grief that I hadn't acknowledged, and so it was almost like I was.
And I wrote this book before COVID.
Yeah,
so
yeah, and then
like
the
world was falling apart when the book came out.
And so there's a part in the book, and I already told you I forgot my book at home. And so I hope I don't mess this up, but you can help me with it. There's a part towards the end, and speaking of crying, where you talk about Jesus taking all of our tears. Mm-hmm. And I could cry right now thinking about it, because that part of the book, I want you to talk about it. I read that for the first time, and I thought, wow, he cares, and he's going to make all this right, and it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And I've gone back to that part several times since my first reading of the book, in moments of wondering, like, Jesus, do you care about this sorrow that I'm walking through? And so I want you to, if you can, to expand on that. And I apologize, I don't have the book, or I would have read from it. But just talk about that idea of, like, Jesus, he's going to take care of us, and he's going to take all of our tears, just like Scripture says. And you said it so beautifully in the book.
Yeah, I probably said it better in the book than I can now. I'm a better writer than I am a talker, for sure.
Well, everyone needs to go read it, because look at how I'm crying about it, and I don't even have it in front of me.
But I don't totally remember. I don't read my books once they're out, because I've read them too much.
I completely understand that.
But I think it's in the chapter on weeping. And
it's at the very last page of whatever chapter it is on the left side of the book.
I think it's the chapter on weeping, and I talk about the scripture that talks about how God will wipe away our tears, and I say, like, okay, that could just be metaphorical, that there will not be tears, but what if it's not? What if before we enter into, like, the fullness and the glory of the new heavens and new earth, and all is set right, what if we get to sort of, we don't just run into that, but we stop and we honor all the losses that got us there, all the broken places, and that we kind of really, I think, for the first time, looking back with the presence of God shows us our story with all of the places we've been deeply wounded, all the places we've deeply wounded others, all the twists and turns and things that did not make sense at the time. And we cry with, we get to weep with the source of life. We get to weep with our Savior, and then God wipes away our tears. That only by actually crying and facing it can God wipe away our tears. But I also think that God ultimately is the only one who can wipe away our tears in a way that is, like, actually healing.
Yeah.
That actually, in that moment, there will be healing that we long for, and we're not going to be able to gin up on our own. So I think that folks can read that as, like, okay, we just won't have any more tears. We'll just pop and be just totally happy. But what if something about wiping away implies that there are tears, right?
Yeah.
That it's not just,
and there's an action
moment of it's not just, like, automatic happiness. And I say in the book, like, I don't know, this is a holy, hopefully, imagination kind of happening here. But I do think that it's hard for me. It almost feels like heaven, or however you want to talk about that, resurrection, the new heavens, the new earth, would be a kind of escapism if there's not a time to be really honest about the hard things and to sort of grapple with God about those things. So I don't, of course, know what that will look like, but I think, there's this other passage about God keeping our tears in the bottle. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like if he cares enough to know the number of hairs on our head and to keep our tears in a bottle, that all of that would just be ignored. Yeah. It feels like part of redemption will be facing that with the only one who can actually heal and can actually see the whole story. Jesus in his resurrection still had scars, right? And so those places, I think, of scarring in our life, and I mean that bodily, but also just spiritually and emotionally, they have to be addressed. They can't just be ignored. Yeah. And so I think whatever redemption looks like, it's not just going to be like I don't know if you've, one time in my life, first time and the last time, went with my mother, wanted to take our kids on a Disney cruise, and it was insane. Yes. But you walk on a Disney cruise and everyone's like, yay, yay, like screaming and cheering, and they're singing songs. I'm not sure that's what it will be like going into heaven. I mean, maybe this is just because I don't like Disney cruises, and so but it feels like there's got to be some sort of acknowledgement of what Jesus actually has saved us from. Yeah. The brokenness of the world. Yeah. So,
when I read it, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see that I still get emotional, even you talking about it. Remember when I read it? When I read it, to me, what it did to me to have this holy imagination, as you said, was to imagine. So when I feel sad here in this body on this earth, my theological knowledge tells me that God is with me and he hasn't left me and he is for me. All those things that we know to be true. When I used my holy imagination, when I read that, I imagined God being with me, like literally with me. Jesus looking at me and letting me weep.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
And him being there, touching me, holding me. And again, I don't know if that's what it's going to be like. But it really did something to me. And it almost made me trust even more in the here and now. Like I really do, like we talked about already, my theological stance, I can get that. I know God's with me in the heart. I know he's here, all those things. But that part about weeping one last time with God before there's no more weeping and letting him wipe all my tears away, it made me love God more.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And so
that's beautiful. I think I don't totally remember that moment, but I think that I think I do. I mean, one of the first of all, thank you. That's beautiful to say. I hope I would love if things I wrote made people love God more. So that's great. Thank you. But also, it's one of the things that makes me love it's why I'm a writer. It's one of the things that makes me love doing this is that I remember this. So we lived in this very small house in Pittsburgh, and we had 3 kids in it. We had 2 kids, and I was pregnant. Anyway. So the only quiet place to work was like the 3rd floor of our house in this little corner. It was not beautiful. It's not like, I know there's, pictures of like professional writers, writing sheds, and it's beautiful. Yeah. And this was not that. This was like dark and sad. Yes. And like I was working on a card table. Yeah. And my husband is a painter and does icons. So there was like paint and like turpentine, like there was like chemicals around
yes.
it. So whatever, we use the same space. So and I'm writing that, and a lot of times when I write, there's sort of like things that I didn't know I knew, or hopes that I didn't know I had, or things are coming out of me that are not. So it wasn't like I sat down and thought, oh, here's an interesting insight on this biblical passage. I mean, I was sort of writing this. And I cry when I do it. I'm crying, not all the time. I mean, I write for a living. A lot of it is just like deadlines and getting it done. But there are these moments where I think, especially with this book, because I was wrestling with these things. I really think the best writing comes out of things that that writers themselves don't get or are wrestling with, trying to get, learning, kind of on the growing edge of their lives. And so that was one of those passages where through that I think I wept when I wrote it too. I think I was thinking maybe this is a better hope than I had, first thought. Yeah. And in a very similar way of like, what would it be like? What would it be like to actually be with God? To be in the presence of Jesus and to be able to acknowledge the pain of my own life, like in specific terms, like, this happened to me when I was 11. What about this moment when I was 15? Like to be able to kind of weep with the one who loves me most, that's I think that I come to the page with these same sort of longings too.
Yeah. And you said we were talking about crying with your husband, and it's a vulnerable state to be so emotional that you cry and shed tears. And I think about that too, like the ability to be completely vulnerable with Jesus, which I want to be that way anyways. But I mean, let's just be real. We have this relationship with a spirit, and there's no one sitting in front of us with a physical body. Right. And so just to imagine that vulnerability of like seeing Jesus, it was just way too much for my feeble little brain to try to figure out. But I think that another thing about this book that is so good is like grief is not like just some people, like you talk about like jokingly about the difference in the two books, but really like everyone is going through grief. Everyone's going to have grief. It is coming for us all. We are living with it.
That's right.
It is here to stay, my friends.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up because that's the second read. Maybe we're just gonna kind
of
go through
the three reasons.
All three.
This is like your own little post therapy session.
But the second reason I was like, so the first reason was like I don't want to go back there.
Yeah.
And the second reason was like I can't write a book on suffering. Like my life hasn't been bad enough. Like it.
You had this idea that it could be worse.
It could be worse, and I mean, I've read beautiful books on suffering. There's whole genres of Christian books on suffering, and some by dear friends of mine, and they're about like the worst things that can happen in life. Like, but they're by and large written by friends of mine who've lost children, which is kind of my nightmare. Yeah. Like my friend Cameron Cole. He wrote a book called Therefore I Have Hope. It's a great book, but and it's written after his 3-year-old son died in the middle of the night. And so I was thinking of Cole, or this great book has I think it's called, what is it called? Oh gosh. We should edit this out. It's by Jerry Sitzer, and I think it's called something like Surprised by Grace, but I can't know. I don't know if that's what it's called. I'll have to look it up. Okay. But it's such a good book about suffering. But he lost his mother and his wife and his daughter in a car accident all together, all at the same time. So and, of course, something like Lament for a Son, Walter Storff's book about losing a son. So I just felt like, I haven't lost a child. I have through miscarriage, but that's common, you know.
Yeah.
So 1 in 4 pregnancies in a miscarriage, and so, you know, it felt like I had lost my dad. I'd lost a parent, but all of us will lose a parent. If we
It's
live,
like the natural, quote unquote, natural progression.
If we live long enough.
Yeah.
I'd moved across the country, but a lot of people have experienced loneliness, and I had, you know, 2 pregnancy losses, and one was a second trimester. It was a hard. They were all hard losses, but it was. I knew this baby. You know, I'd seen this baby so many times, but still, it felt this is fairly common, and so I was like, Lord, I can't write about suffering. It will seem like it'll just seem whiny, you know. It'll just seem, it could be worse, you know. I heard my father's voice in my head, like, it could be worse. But and that ended up actually being sort of a part of the book. I think kind of a gift of the book is saying that we can think of grief. I certainly could think of grief as this phenomenon that happens to this certain group of people,
right?
Like to this kind of people who particularly suffer, and they write books on suffering, and they kind of report to us, you know, that
in case we ever get into their club,
right? Yep. Exactly. And it felt like, no, this is exactly why you should write this book. Is that first of all, I realized something being common doesn't make it hurt less when you're going through it.
Yeah.
But second, and I am not, I want very clear, I'm not saying that grief is all equal. I am not saying that suffering is all equal. It's not. I mean, there are folks that suffer more deeply than others. Yeah. And my life in so many ways is just wrapped around with privilege. And yet, even for the sort of the best of lives, grief is part of it for all of us, and that grief is real. Yeah. And knowing that other people have grief, or knowing that other people have it worse, it can become a way of not actually looking at your own grief. And I think that we cannot know God in the way that God has made us to know him, unless we meet him in pain, in the places of grief of our life. I think he's waiting for us in the places of grief in our life, and we will not meet him there if we just constantly, if we shame ourselves for feeling grief because it's not as bad as others. It's not as bad as other people. And so the second reason was sort of like, I can't write this book because I haven't gone through the worst thing I can imagine. And part of the book, I mean, I talk in the book about sort of grief being like the white noise in every life, like it's just there. And it's kind of, I mean, it's even, I mean, there's been moments of real beauty in my life, goodness in my life, where grief sort of rears its head. Yeah. And I still sense a sense of loss, or a sense of grief, or even just that life is fragile. Yep. And that this really lovely moment can't last, you know, or won't last. And so I just think none of us get through life without grief. And without loss, like very real loss. And so making grief like the property of, of just a small group of people, or something that you have to kind of earn the right to be sad, actually just diminishes the reality of what it is to be human. And I think robs us of ways that we could actually meet God in the pain that we have. So that was sort of my second objection to God that got knocked down.
Well, it's even like how when you said just now, like we meet God in the midst of this grief, and I agree 100%. And then when you pair that with what you say in your book, that grief is like this white noise, it's constantly around us.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it has even just made me think just now, like, which ways am I avoiding God today?
Oh, that's interesting.
Because I'm not willing to acknowledge an emotion, face an emotion, deal with an emotion. I mean, if I think about just my day today, what is today? April 13th. Like, I have just been going from one thing to the next. But you're right when you say that there are things, if I were to stop and think, there are things that I'm grieving today, whatever that might be. And what if I looked at that as an opportunity to meet God?
Yeah.
Instead of an opportunity to, like, I don't have time to feel sad, or I don't have time to think about that.
Yeah. Right.
If you just flip that, I mean, I'm just thinking about my day today. I would have met with God a lot today, But I mean, I think it's just encouraging because there's nobody that's ever come on my podcast when we're discussing something that they've been through that has been difficult or hard, and it doesn't have to fall in that category of like the worst thing in the world. There's no one that hasn't, they all say the same thing. Every single person. They say, I knew God more in that season, in that grief, than I ever have before. And there has to be something to, like, meeting God in the midst of that. And the way that we're talking about it here, it's like that's available to us today.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I talk about this. This goes, actually, I say this in Liturgy, the Ordinary. So I started, I was wrestling with some of these same things there, is that I think that if we train ourselves, I know, I proclaim, I would preach, I've been to seminary, that God meets us in suffering. But if we sort of train ourselves to say, okay, God meets us in suffering, and suffering is only the worst thing that ever happens to me, it's like it's like we're waiting
for the worst
to meet God. Whereas I actually think the only way that we're going to be able to sort of like embrace the presence of God in that darkness is if we sort of like practice on lesser things,
which is,
and we kind of can miss God, I think, in ordinary suffering if we're always waiting for, if we go, okay, yes, if I get cancer, God will be there,
right?
But God isn't there for me right now,
right.
As whatever it is, like a young mom who hasn't had sleep in 3 days because my kid has an ear infection, and I, whatever, also have a 3-year-old that's wanting my attention, and our freaking sink is backed up and won't work, and
that's something to grieve. My
husband, whatever, like yelled at me, or I yelled at him, and there's just this sort of like, okay, like that's a really ordinary bad day.
Yeah.
But if we don't learn to sort of meet God in that, then not only are we like missing out, I think, on encounters with God, but I also think we're sort of, how are we then going to sort of like turn around in our darkest moment if we haven't sort of
practiced it?
Yeah, practice this in our ordinary lives. Yeah. And I think I knew, I kind of was trained to look for God in suffering, but I always thought of that as catastrophe, and so I wasn't trained to look for God in kind of the ordinary suffering of a week, and so I think there's something lost, I think, in that.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is also we have to reevaluate what deserves grieving, because there's this idea that, like, you grieve when someone dies, you grieve when you lost a job, you grieve, you know what I mean, like these big things like you're saying. But even as we're talking, without giving any details, right before we started recording, my daughter calls me. She had a problem, she needed me, and I chose to stay here and interview with you and had someone else go help her.
Yeah,
I don't regret that decision, but even as we're talking, I'm like, oh, I could grieve that moment. Yeah, that I had to work instead of going to be with her.
Right.
And that is a moment that isn't big. Everyone's fine. It's not that big of a deal. Yeah. But I can acknowledge that and say, I feel a little sad.
Yeah.
that I didn't get to be the one to help her.
Yeah, totally. I totally get that and feel that. And I have been dealing, my daughter has faced some sort of like difficulty in school and some social stuff that's just hard. Very normal. She's in middle school, so very normal kind of, but some like bullying stuff and that kind of thing. And I think you're right. My first instinct was to sort of belittle it, to be like, it's normal, don't grieve this. But I'm realizing like the reality that my daughter is going to suffer in this world, and I can't rescue her from all of that, is really pain. It's really grievous to me. And the way that I know, I don't actually feel sad. My response as a mom is anxiety. How can I fix this? Well, the reality is I can't.
Right.
And anything that I stepped in and tried to do would be like a little neurotic and a little like
she would probably ask you to stop.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
Uh-huh.
But underneath that anxiety is just this deep grief that I do not want my kids to suffer. Yeah. I don't want them to suffer big, and I don't want them to suffer small. Mm-hmm. I want to rescue them from all of that. And as she gets older and older, I can't. Mm-hmm. I mean, even as a kid, and so, as a little kid. So part of this grief, like that you felt with your daughter, that I'm feeling with my daughter about social stuff, or the made up mom who has the backed up sink with a kid with a ear infection. This touches on much bigger. Like, yes, we're grieving because people die. Of course, that is like true grief. Yeah. But the fact is, before we die, there's lots of kinds of small suffering that we experience that is real, and that what I'm saying, I think, is like, to some extent, we are grieving death. Even in that, like when the kid has an ear infection, you're grieving that there's sickness in the world that you can't stop. That no matter how much you love this little person, and I've felt this at 3 a.m. No matter how much I love this person, I cannot take this pain away from them. And yes, they're going to probably survive, but eventually they're not. And feeling, I think there's like I think there's a taste of that. I think there's the taste of
like our
fragility,
broken bodies, and
our fragility. And I talk in the book. This was a very helpful concept to me. About being vulnerable, which we can talk about. We can talk about vulnerability in terms of sort of like, I'm choosing to be like emotionally open or honest. That's a fine way of talking about it. That's not the way I use the term in my book. I talk about vulnerability as an unavoidable human condition. So you can be John Wayne and you're still vulnerable. Right. I mean, he's dead. So he experienced vulnerability in a way that I even have not yet. And that that word vulner is from Latin, is wound. So it's able to be wounded. And all of us live able to be wounded. We all live vulnerably. And from before we're born, but when we are conceived until our dying day, the most kind of charismatic, happiest, think of the person who's like, whatever, they have like a great house and a great family, and the Christmas card looks so good. Like, that person is able to be wounded every minute of their life. And I mean that physically, I mean that emotionally, I mean that spiritually. And I don't just mean wounded by other people, I mean by our own bodies breaking down, by the just the tragic nature of history. And we all live in that world. We all live in a world where we deeply know we're fragile. This is the way that we're different than like my dog or whatever. I think that we experience that fragility we know we're going to die, and that the people that we love are going to die. And so there's real grief around just being a vulnerable human being that we that's like honest. It's like honest about our state of who we are. And that doesn't mean that there's not also like ecstatic joy. But just that we never stop being vulnerable. And so some of our grief that you expressed about your daughter and you know, and about my daughter that I expressed about my daughter, there's their physical vulnerability, their social vulnerability, their emotional vulnerability that is painful to us as people who love them, as mothers, that we can't rescue them from that. And we can't rescue ourselves from that either. And so I think what I'm saying is these little things are actually tapping on something really big and really true about the human condition.
Right.
Like when your sink backs up and everything's falling apart, it's not just that you're sad about that.
Yeah.
It's that you're sad about the uncontrollability of the world that we walk through.
Yeah. And those little things, I mean, you're right, because we can see the massive things on the news or even our own personal lives. But those little things, it is this evidence that we are vulnerable humans walking with broken bodies to all of our eventual deaths. I mean, you know, it's all of us. That's what's coming for us. And that can bring grief up when you think about it in the little things.
Yeah, and I don't mean, if people are listening, like, of course we have perspective. Like, of course we don't weep over our sink clogging up as we do over, you know, a loved one dying or even, like, horrific tragedy in the world. And yet, we're grieving the chaos. We're grieving the fall. Like, it's what we're grieving. What I grieve a lot of times is not even the specific thing as much as just that, like, the world is not how it is meant to be. And we feel that. We feel that every moment. And I think one of the things I love about the Christian story, part of the reason I'm still a Christian, and one of the things I love about the gospel, is it tells me that the feelings I feel that this is not how things are supposed to be, that this is not how the world is supposed to be, that's not just like wishful thinking, that's true, that actually touches on true reality. Because if there is no God, if there is no redemption, if we weren't created for a place of beauty and joy, then the world just is the way it is. Like,
there'd be nothing to grieve because this would be what it would be, right? Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Well, I'm saying, the world, like, we live in a world where the strong prey on the weak. Like, you see this in nature. Like, that it is the way things are.
Yeah.
And so Christianity frees me up to say, okay, it's the way things are, but it's not how things are intended to be. Yeah. And so the gap.
And how they will be.
Right.
You know,
And how they were.
Yeah,
and
how
so
they were and how they will be.
Between how things are and how things are meant to be is that space of grief. That's what the grief comes from. And so it touches on something, I believe, that's really true. It's not just fantasy. It's real that we feel that.
And that's the space we're in. And so it's where we are. Tish, I love this book because, we could talk about it forever, and I could tell you how much I love it. You start the
because it was the best book of 2021.
It was the best book of 2021, says Jamie Ivey and Christianity Today. I knew I was going to love it when in the introduction you said, when I was a priest who could not pray, and then you talk about what led you to that, and I was like, okay, I can relate to this. This is where I have felt alone in the night. I want to ask you. Before I ask you what you're reading, I want to know what you're working on these days. Do you working on any projects?
Yeah, well, the main project that takes up my time in the week right now is that I write every week for the New York Times. So that takes loads of time.
You got to go read it because I've been loving it.
Thanks. Yeah. Yes, please subscribe to the Times, and then you can opt into my newsletter, and then it comes right to your inbox. Yep. Or you can also just read it online. It's on the main page too. So that takes a lot of time and energy. But I've also have a book coming out that we just did the final proofs for. it's a very different project in that it's a smaller project. It's like I don't know. I think about it as like a watercolor instead of an oil painting. But it's literally a smaller project. Like it is a half-size book, so it is a shorter project. My husband and I wrote it together.
Awesome.
And it's on Advent, the season of Advent. Mm-hmm. It's part of a series with InterVarsity Press.
Okay.
Called the Fullness of Time series.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 6 of us, I think it's 6, that came together, and we each took
part of the church calendar.
We each took part of the church calendar, and we're all like liturgical folks in some way. So it's Esau McCauley. He's the general
We're huge
editor.
fans of Esau over here.
And then Wesley Hill did Easter. Emilio Alvarez did Pentecost, and then I did Advent. And then Emily McGowan at Wheaton, she's a theologian, did Christmas. And then Fleming Rutledge did Epiphany.
I love it.
And so we each have a book, and you can read them individually and buy them individually, but then they also will be sold as a like set. And it's like everything you need to know about Advent, in the sense that it's kind of like I mean, there's like I don't know if IVP wants me to do this, but I've been joking that it's like Advent for Dummies, in the sense that like it'll just tell you, it's just like those For Dummies book were like an intro to the whole thing. So it's like a theological exploration of it and a thematic, like emotional, but then it's also very practical. Like, here are some practices that you can do, and this is how you do them. Like, I actually explain, like, here's how you should fast. Like, here's an example. Like, if you haven't fasted before, here's some things to keep in mind. So it's in some ways it's kind of more practical than some of my books, but it will be a really good book for church groups to read together.
So it comes out like October, November.
I think it's coming out in August.
Okay, good. Get us ready.
Way before Advent. Yeah. I don't know why. I guess they do that so people can read it and then decide like can have time to read it and decide if they want to read it in a group for churches and that sort of thing. But I like it. It's a cool book, and so that's my next one. It's a small book that is everything you need to know about the liturgical season of Advent. But it also it'll be appealing, like even if you don't keep Advent, because it deals a lot with Advent is all about like waiting in darkness for light to come. It's all about waiting for the coming of Christ. I mean, it's about preparation for Christmas, but one of the points I make in the book is it actually historically is far more about waiting for Jesus to return, to come again, and to set things right. And so it's this, like we've sort of talked about today, it's this liminal space of like the already, the not yet. We've seen Jesus come, but things are still broken in the world. And so if that resonates, you don't, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't care if you practice Advent, but I think that Karl Barth, I quote this, says that what other season do we ever live in besides Advent? Besides waiting. Yeah. And so all Christians live in this place of Jesus has come and Jesus has not yet set all things right, and we're in that space. So it's a book about Advent, but I think it's really about life. Our life as it is. We live in Advent, yes, whether you know it or not. When David was here, David Taylor came and started our Advent season. He gave us such a history lesson on Advent, and it was so good. And that's so cool. I love when he comes in and gives us history lessons. Yeah, David and I are at the same church now. I love it. Yeah. So great. He's great. So great. Okay, Tish, I'd love to hear what you're reading, but today's What Are You Reading segment is sponsored by Taylor Joy Murray and her new book, Stop Saying I'm Fine, Finding Stillness When Anxiety Screams. If that doesn't go well with what we've talked about today, Tish, I don't know what else. Okay, so Taylor has a new book out, and here's the question, guys. Are you more familiar with anxiety than you want to be? Maybe you've tried to pray and trust God more, but you still feel defeated. Author Taylor Joy Murray can relate.
Stop Saying I'm Fine is written out of Taylor's own struggle to live well inside of a story where anxiety is a dominant theme. With practical insights and vulnerability, Taylor invites you to process the story behind your anxiety and discover, as she has, the stillness that you're looking for isn't as distant as it seems. Taylor, thank you for that. There's a shirt that my friends Amy Brown and Mary do from Shop Forward. And it says, I'm fine, everything's okay. And that's what it makes me think of. That's Taylor's book. She needs that shirt. Stop Saying I'm Fine. What are you reading these days?
So right now on my bedside table is I shouldn't feel dumb about this. I always feel dumb. No dumb. This, but everyone is reading this book.
Okay, what is it?
And I am too. But I'm reading Beth Moore's memoir, All My Knotted Up Life.
In 2021, everyone was reading your book. See? Because it was the best book of the year.
And I do. It's been great. Her memoir is really.
It's really
compelling.
Good. Yep.
So I'm just over halfway through.
Have you shed any tears? Are you a crier?
I am a crier.
Okay.
I don't know.
I cried today when I was reading a book.
I don't know if I've shed tears. It is unusual for me to cry when I'm reading.
Okay, well, you're going to have to come back and let me know, report back, because I cried at the end of her book.
Oh, I haven't gotten
As I was spending, yeah, so I'm just saying you could.
I would recommend it.
Like yeah.
If
I highly recommend it.
And so that is one book I'm reading. I read a lot for my job.
Mm-hmm.
So I could tell you things I'm reading for my job, but that right now, that is the book. The books on my bedside table are not books I'm reading for my job.
Yeah.
They're the books I'm reading because I want to
yeah.
and I'm enjoying them.
Uh-huh.
And so that's the book that I'm reading that is like my. It would be wrong to call it my fun book, because that's, although she is very funny in it.
Yeah.
But it's my reading for leisure book.
It's a memoir. Yeah. You know, it's like someone's life. I love it.
And memoir is my favorite genre.
Mine too.
I'm reading.
Tell me what else I should read.
What are my favorite memoirs? Oh my gosh, I have too many. But I will give you some.
Give me some.
Have you read Lit by Mary Carr?
I have a long time. Well, it's been out a while. Like,
yeah. I'm a lot of the ones I'm going to tell you.
Okay, keep
are
going.
My
Yes.
They're old. So that's one of my very favorites. I love The Long Loneliness by Dorothy Day.
You were the second person I've interviewed that's told me that. Okay.
It's such a great book.
Okay.
Those are some that come to mind. Esau McCauley's coming out with a memoir. It's
he
amazing.
Is?
Yes.
Is that public, or is this? Am I getting insider scoop?
No, it's public.
Okay,
it's
good.
Public. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. I think you can pre-order it. Let me think. What are some other memoirs that I just love? There is a book. Oh my goodness, I forget the name, but I think it is also Surprised by Something. Maybe it's Surprised by Joy, but that's another Lewis book. I'll have to look.
Okay.
But it is the story of Joy Davidman.
Okay, I don't know
who married C.S. Lewis.
Oh,
and her life is interesting.
Okay.
I mean, she had a rough life.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Those are some. I know I'm going to walk out of here and be like, oh, I should have said
You can send me, tell them to me.
But, yeah.
Okay. I'll need to know if you cry at the end of Beth's book. This is a memoir that is not like any of the ones you listed. But have you read Matthew McConaughey's book, Green Lights?
I have not.
Okay. It's nothing like anything you just listed. I'm not even I wouldn't call myself like a Matthew McConaughey fan. Okay. Mm-hmm. I'm just like, he is who he is. He lives here in Austin.
Yes.
All the things.
Yeah.
I listened to it and he reads it and it was so entertaining.
His voice is
so
great.
I just want to throw that out there.
Okay.
It's entertaining.
Okay. So in terms of pop culture memoirs,
mm-hmm.
my favorite, I read this a few years ago, but have you read Jeff Tweedy's, it's called...
I don't even know who that is.
Oh, he's the lead singer of Wilco.
I don't even know who that band is.
Oh, really?
I'm not a music person.
They're great.
Okay.
But it's called, something like Let's Go. Maybe it's just called Let's Go.
Okay.
But in parentheses, it's like, so we can come back again.
Okay.
That's what it's called.
Okay.
It's so good. And he talks a lot about recovery in
Uh-huh.
it because he became addicted to prescription drugs. I hope I'm not giving anything away. You should just
I bet
read
you
the
could Google
memoir.
that.
But like, I don't know if we're allowed to talk about our earlier conversation, but he was in recovery with all these people who had in some ways much worse lives than he did, and so he felt like he couldn't like talk about his own pain because like he wasn't. And one of the people who'd had kind of the roughest life got in his face, and he was like, "Don't compare yourself to me. Don't compare yourself to others. Like, you got to feel your own pain.
Wow.
You got to walk your own story." And it was so freeing to him. But I mean, he talks about it as this pivotal point in recovery. And so I have a whole hobby horse that I think that we have so much to learn from the recovery community. But one of it is like, your grief is your grief.
That's right.
Like, own it.
Yeah.
But he talks about this in the book. I can't remember if I read it before or after the book came out, but it's a great book.
Okay. Because you like pop culture, have you read Bono's new book?
Yes. Well, it is also on the bedside table.
Okay.
So I haven't read all of Bono's new book, but I've read maybe a fourth of Bono's book. Enough. Like, he's been through some sad stuff already.
I haven't finished it either. It's a book I'm listening to very slowly. I don't know why. But my husband read it, and he's like, it's one of the best books I've ever read. And
beautiful.
He loves Bono anyways.
So part of the reason I haven't finished it, I am reading it slowly, but then I was told by so many people, you have to listen to it on audiobook.
Because he reads it.
I don't listen to audio books very much. I know that lots of people do.
Yeah.
But I don't. I'm just not in situations where I could very often. And so, but multiple people have been like, if you don't listen to any other book on audio, listen to this, because they insert, like, he'll talk about a song and then they'll play it or play part of it.
Yeah.
So I was reading it. I saw Bono and Brene Brown interviewed Bono at the Paramount, and I was there.
Okay.
And so, so if you were there, you got the book. So I got the book, like whatever, before it came out, and I started reading it, and then I'm still reading it slowly, but I'm hesitating because I might actually get
Go
the
listen to it.
audiobook.
I hear it's worth it. Yeah.
It's great so far.
Yeah.
Very sad.
Yeah.
But really, really pretty beautiful.
I love it. Tish, thanks for coming on the Happy Hour.
Yeah.
I have loved it. And thank you for your work. I'm so glad God gave you the gift of writing, because we are all benefiting from it. And so thank you.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much.